it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Hussey's Huddle. In this video, we'll be redrafting the top 10 of the 2011 CFL Draft. A draft that's a lot more interesting than the draft I covered recently of the 2010 CFL Draft. It has a lot more comparable players, and it's going to make the selections very tricky. But really quickly before we get started, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I really appreciate all the support, and with that said, let's get into this redraft. Now before we dive in, I'll quickly go over the criteria I am basing my picks on here. So generally speaking, the order in which I redraft these players is going to be in like the best player available method. I'm not really taking into consideration needs that teams had at the time of the draft, mostly because that would be a headache to go back and dig up, and I also don't find it all too relevant, as CFL teams in hindsight would probably rather pick the best player available in most cases anyway. Additionally, in cases where it is kind of like a toss-up between the players, I usually revert to my own ideas about the value of positions within the context of the Canadian game to break the tie between those players. And with that said, let's dive into this class, which made me make some really tough redraft decisions right from the jump. So at number 1 in the draft, we had the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who originally took linebacker Muamba out of St. Francis Xavier. Winnipeg absolutely crushed this pick back in 2011, taking the generational Atlantic U Sports prospect Muamba. He would play his first 3 seasons in Winnipeg before spending some time in the NFL with the Indianapolis Colts. He would return to the CFL with stops in Saskatchewan and Montreal, capturing the league's Most Outstanding Canadian award in 2019, and he signed with Toronto this offseason, so it's going to be interesting to see how he does as the still reigning, Most Outstanding Canadian player. However, though the margin was really razor thin in my mind, in this redraft I am selecting Ottawa quarterback Brad Sinopoli at number 1 overall, who was originally picked in the 4th round, 29th overall. A star at quarterback for the GGs, Sinopoli reverted to wide receiver a few years into his CFL career, where he really truly broke out. Over his career, Sinopoli has accumulated 4 1,000-yard seasons, along with 19 touchdowns, twice capturing the league's Most Outstanding Canadian award in the process. In my mind, Sinopoli is one of the best Canadian receivers I've ever seen play in the CFL. And number 2, the Edmonton football team had this original selection, and originally they took offensive lineman Scott Mitchell out of Rice. He was a serviceable offensive lineman who lasted a handful of CFL seasons with both Edmonton and Toronto. He had a very respectable career. But in this redraft, the pick is obvious, and that is Muamba. Like I mentioned in the last blurb, you could easily have picked Muamba at number 1, and I would have no reservations about it. has quite simply been one of the best Canadians in the CFL for years, and I'm very excited to see, again, what he can do with the Argos in 2021, if this season is to take place, which we are all wondering. Moving on to number 3, and Calgary originally had this pick via the BC Lions. The selection back in 2011 for Calgary was Calgary receiver Anthony Parker, who has had a really solid CFL career and is actually still active in the league. We'll talk about more about him in a bit. But with this redraft selection, though, I'm going with offensive lineman Matt O'Donnell from Queens. O'Donnell, who stands at an incredible 6'11", has been one of the CFL's best linemen over the past half-decade, with 2 divisional all-star appearances to show for it. In my opinion, had he not been hurt relatively early in 2019, he would have been a shoo-in for a 3rd divisional all-star appearance. He remains signed here in the 2021 offseason, with reports of him considering retirement or waiting until the league has a bit more clarity on this 2021 season to sign with a team. But he's been one of the best players from this draft class, no doubt about it. Moving on to number 4, and Winnipeg was again on the clock, and they owned Toronto's pick in this case. And the original pick here was wide receiver Jade Etienne from the University of Saskatchewan. Etienne only played in 2 CFL seasons, catching a total of 20 passes for 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. But in this redraft, we'll go with Craig Butler, who had a relatively short career of 7 years, but had perhaps the highest peak of any player in this draft class not named Sinopoli or Muamba. Butler would go on to be named to 3 divisional all-star games with Hamilton and Saskatchewan, while winning a Grey Cup with the Riders in 2013. In total, he racked up 8 sacks, 13 interceptions, and 3 forced fumbles over his time in the league. Moving on to number 5, Edmonton was on the clock. They owned Hamilton's selection in this case, and the original pick here was wide receiver Nathan Coulthard, again out of the University of Calgary. Coulthard had a very productive CFL career with Edmonton, who made a really strong selection, even with the benefit of hindsight here. However, my pick here is Tulsa offensive lineman Tyler Holmes, who originally was picked a few spots later at number 7 overall. Holmes was a standout at guard for much of his career with the Argos, ultimately being named twice to a divisional all-star team. His longevity really stands out to me in this draft class when weighed against the other offensive linemen in this draft outside of O'Donnell. At number 6, we have the BC Lions, who owned Calgary's selection in this case. Man, looking back, there was actually a lot of trades back in the day for this draft. But I digress. The original pick here was wide receiver Marco Ayanusi out of Harvard, of all places. Ayanusi was a really solid pick at the time by the Lions, who spent 7 years on the team's roster and was a very solid depth receiver in their offense. However, in this redraft, I'm going to pick someone who is still active in the league as a regular starter, and that's offensive lineman Phillip. Blake took a while to actually come to the CFL because he was actually selected in the 4th round of the NFL draft that year, but came to the league in 2015 and has since established himself as a regular, everyday CFL offensive lineman. What stood out from his 2019 film to me was his presence as a run blocker, especially as a pulling guard where his athleticism really stands out at the CFL level. Unfortunately, he's really battled injuries throughout his career, especially over the last few seasons, and is now 35, but we will see what he brings to the Argos in 2021. At number 7, again, another traded pick. The Argos were on the clock via Saskatchewan, and the original pick here was offensive lineman Tyler Holmes out of Tulsa. With Holmes off the board by the time Toronto picks in this redraft, my pick here is someone that isn't flashy but has provided excellent value to his team throughout his career, and that's Junior Turner, who originally was picked 9th overall by Calgary. Turner gave Calgary an extremely dependable and startable defensive lineman who finished his career with 17 sacks and over 150 tackles. Definitely not the most eye-popping numbers in the world, but just a very steady career, and the longevity gets him this high on this list, especially as a defensive lineman. Not many Canadian impactful defensive linemen out there in the league right now. At number 8, Montreal is picking with their own pick for once, and the original pick here was kicker/punter Brody McKnight out of Montana. McKnight really did much in the CFL, with several teams giving him various chances within just a short 2-year period from 2012 to 2013. After that, he was out of the league. But for this redraft selection, we're staying on special teams and snagging punter Hugh O'Neill. The longtime Edmonton punter has a 44.5-yard career punting average and has also briefly carried field goal kicking duties earlier in his career. So just a really consistent career for Hugh O'Neill. At number 9, we have Calgary, who owned Winnipeg's pick in this case. Originally, they took defensive lineman Junior Turner out of Bishops. Again, our original selection is off the board, so Calgary in this scenario takes kicker/punter Chris Milo, who, if not for longevity, might have been my selection over O'Neill. Milo won a 2013 Grey Cup with the Rough Riders in 2013 and made over 81% of his field goal attempts throughout his time in the CFL. But before we get into our 10th and final redraft selection, a list of honorable mentions who just missed the cut. Wide receiver Nathan Coulthard, who I talked about earlier, had a really good 6-year career with Edmonton and was a part of that 2015 Grey Cup winning team. And then we have wide receiver Julian Fioli Gadino out of Laval, one of a handful of players that is still active. Fioli Gadino has long been a presence on special teams, but has never quite established himself consistently as a receiver at the CFL level, despite some notable flashes, like in the Grey Cup a few years ago against Calgary. Another honorable mention here is running back Matt Walter out of the University of Calgary. the Dinos had a lot of players selected in this year's draft. Walter was a very dependable running back for Calgary for a good chunk of time, with a single season career high of 454 rushing yards. And our last honorable mention is wide receiver Marco Ayanusi from Harvard. We previously discussed Ayanusi, just a really solid depth receiver throughout his CFL career, just missing the cut in this scenario. And finally, we have the last pick of our redraft at number 10, with the Hamilton Tiger Cats on the clock, who owned Edmonton's pick here in the second round. The original pick here was offensive lineman Mo Petras out of Connecticut. Petras was one of the biggest busts in this entire draft class, deciding to retire before even playing a single CFL game. So needless to say, we're going elsewhere with this pick. This was a very difficult decision between a couple of receivers, but ultimately I decided to go with Anthony Parker, who is still on an active roster in Edmonton. Parker has never been a star, but has often been a steady producer, with 4 straight seasons of 350 plus receiving yards from 2014 till 2017 with Calgary. Add in 15 career touchdowns, and Parker is our last pick of today's redraft. And with that said, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching. Let me know in the comment section what your redraft order would be for this draft class. And once again, my name is Jason. If you would like to support the channel, the best way to do it is by liking, subscribing, or sharing the video with a friend. I would really appreciate that. And with those things said, I'll catch you guys next time.